Okay, so this is our coagulation 5-minute rounds, and this is based on a lecture that I saw given by Dr. Adalik Adesina when he was still a medical student. And he is the founder of FTP Lectures, and he was really funny, and that video was amazing and got me through my my first phase of boards for residency. So all of his videos are down right now, so I'm going to try to recreate that for you. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is primary hemostasis, and this is our platelet plug. So the first thing that happens, so we have, I'll set the stage, we have our endothelial cells here, and then something is going to come in and disrupt that layer. So when we have a break, this exposes this area here, exposed subendothelial collagen and tissue factor. Okay, and we're going to come back to that later. So the very first thing that happens when we have this break is that von Willebrand factor will come in. And it is released from the endothelial cells, but it's also floating around in the plasma attached to factor H, which it kind of protects. And we'll come back to that later as well. So now we have our von Willebrand factor that is on the basement membrane. So the next thing that's going to happen is that platelets are going to come in because they have a receptor for von Willebrand factor. We'll say this is von Willebrand factor. Okay, so then they have these receptors. This is a platelet. These receptors called GP1B that attach to the von Willebrand factor. And when that attachment happens, it activates the platelets. So next we have platelet activation. So now they're spiky and activated, and three things are going to happen when they become activated. They are going to release thromboxane, A2, and ADP, which are going to recruit more platelets. So these are platelets that are coming, it's going to recruit them and promote aggregation. And then the other thing that's going to happen is they're going to relocate a receptor to their surface called GP2B3A, which is a receptor for fibrinogen. And remember that that ogen ending means that it's an inactive form. So this is a receptor for the inactive form of fibrin, which is fibrinogen. So let's clear that, and then we'll just put it all together. So we have our von Willebrand factor that came in, our platelets attached to it with their GP1B receptor. Then they became activated and started expressing these GP2B3A receptors. They also released thromboxane A2 and ADP, which recruited more platelets to come in. And these GP2B3A receptors are receptors for fibrinogen. So we form this little meshwork. This is fibrinogen. And so this is our primary platelet plug. Platelet plug, it's not very stable. And for the primary hemostasis, we measure the function of if everything's working using BMBT. So if everything in this part of the of hemostasis is working, we'll have a normal BMBT. If any part of this is not working, then we'll have an increased BMBT. And we're going to talk about that in the second part, the second coagulation lecture. So the second part of hemostasis is our secondary hemostasis. Secondary hemostasis, and this is our, coagulation cascade. So I'm going to just draw this kind of mnemonic that I learned from Dr. Adelique Adesina that really helped me to remember how everything fits together. So first we're going to draw this T, and we're going to put all of the coagulation factors into this diagram. But first we need to talk about some special ones. So the way that I remember the order is we have 10 is a really special number, so it's going to go at the top of the T. Then 7 is our lucky number, so we're going to put it down here. And then 10 minus 7 is 3, so I'm going to add that number here. And then some other special numbers, 4 is calcium, and I'm just going to put that off to the side because it's not going to go in our coagulation cascade, but just know that you pretty much need calcium for every part of hemostasis, which is why we bind calcium or inhibit calcium when we want to stop hemostasis, like when we in our collection tubes. And then 6 doesn't exist. Doesn't exist. So you don't have to worry about 6. Okay, now we are ready to just count down. So we have 12, 11, 10's already being used, so we're going to do next is 9. 8 kind of goes up here because it's a cofactor. 8, 7's already used, 6 doesn't exist, so our next number is 5. It's also a cofactor, so it goes up there. 4 is calcium, 3 is down here, so next we have 2 and 1. Okay, so that is the order of the numbers. That's all you need to remember to keep track of your intrinsic, extrinsic, and common pathways. But we'll go into a little bit more detail. So there are 3 things that we want to know, that we want to remember about each of the pathways. So this is this top one here that goes along the top that is long is one of the pathways. And then this one here is another one of the pathways. So there's 3 things that we want to know about each. We want to know which one's intrinsic, which one's extrinsic, which one measures PT, which one measures PTT, and which one is primarily affected by heparin, and which one is affected first by warfarin. So the way that I remember that is first we'll say which one is extrinsic and which one is intrinsic. So this line down here could be turned into an E. So this one is extrinsic, which means this is intrinsic. And then PT versus PTT, this line on top is a lot longer, so it gets a longer name, PTT, and which means this one is PT. And then the last thing is which drug affects the each pathway more. Down here, this pathway is shaped like a water gun. So guns are used in war, so this one is more affected by warfarin, affects this pathway first, and then that means that this one is more affected by heparin. Okay, so that is our kind of the basic things that we need to remember about each pathway. It can also be helpful. Oh, I will say I wanted to add that this is our common pathway. And the way that you can remember that is you just need 2 lines to remember, and you can use your fingers for this. 2 lines. The first line can be used to make a 1. If you add the other line, that makes a 2. If you make the lines meet at the bottom, that makes the Roman numeral 5. And if you make the lines cross, that makes an X. So now you have your common pathway, 1, 2, 5, 10. Okay, and then it can also help to know the names of the different components of the pathway. So factor 1 is fibrinogen. Factor 2 is prothrombin. And this is just a cofactor. We don't really use its name very much. This is Stewart factor. This is tissue factor. This is antihemophilic A, antihemophilic A, antihemophilic B, antihemophilic C. This one's also called Christmas factor, and this one is also called PTA. And then the last one is Hagman. Okay, so this one also used to be called 7 used to be called proconvertin, and you might hear a deficiency referred to as hypoproconvertinemia, but we don't really use that term very frequently. Okay, so then the other thing that is important to understand is when we're doing an in vitro test in a test tube, what are we doing and what exactly does that test mean? So for in vitro, for testing the extrinsic pathway, we're going to add tissue factor, calcium, and phospholipids. Okay, so that we're adding everything that the extrinsic pathway needs to go to completion. So it only says that from here on out, this part, these things that are present in the extrinsic pathway are normal. For the intrinsic pathway, in vitro, we're adding calcium again. We're adding phospholipids, and we're adding negatively charged particles. And this is glass beads. So as you may know, we don't have glass beads coursing through our blood. So this is artificial. This is not where the coagulation, this is not how coagulation happens in our body. So when we're adding this and we're looking at this in vitro, we're stimulating factor 12, and then it's going to 11, 9, 8, 10, 5, 2, 1. So if factor 12 isn't working, like with Hagman deficiency, we get a really prolonged PTT. But that's actually not how coagulation happens in the body. So those patients don't have any bleeding issues. So the way that coagulation actually happens in vivo is that we have the tissue factor from that was exposed when we had the break, and then tissue factor and 7 form a complex, and then they activate 7, 10, and 9. Okay, and then when we get to the end here, we're going to look a little bit closer at this. We have prothrombin. When prothrombin is activated, it becomes thrombin. And then the presence of thrombin stimulates fibrinogen to become fibrin. Okay, and remember, this is our fibrinogen here in our platelet plug. So what happens when that turns to fibrin is we get, this turns to fibrin, and now we have cross-linking. This is our, this is the end of secondary hemostasis. And this is a stable. Now it's stable. Okay, so some other things that happen though are we have, let's see what other colors I have. Thrombin does some additional things too. So it stimulates factor 13, which is a fibrin stabilizing factor. And then it also activates 5, 8, and 11. So this is kind of the propagation phase where we've created a clot, and now the presence of that, making that clot has feedback on other parts of the coagulation cascade, a positive feedback. So you can see while the tissue factor 7 complex really starts the coagulation cascade at 9, we get feedback to 11. But nothing in the body really uses 12, so that's why 12 is not really needed. And then the very, very last thing that I'm going to say is that these, I know this is getting really, really busy. These things here, so 2, 7, 9, 10, those are vitamin K dependent. And the way that I remember that when I was a student was I would just chant it over and over again. I'll never forget it. I don't know why that works, but I would just say 2, 7, 9, 10, like I was a freaking cheerleader. So that's how I remember it, but it makes this nice little triangle in this mnemonic as well. So we'll stop there for now. And then the next time I'm going to go over this mnemonic like very quickly with not as much like busyness. And then we're going to talk about how different diseases and drugs affect your coagulation parameters. Okay, there you go.